But how useful! I see you don't like our Bokanovsky groups, but I assure you, they're the foundations on which everything else is built. They're the gyroscope that stabilizes the rocket plane of state on its unswerving course. The deep voice thrillingly vibrated. The gesticulating hand implied all space and the onrush of the irresistible machine. Mustafa Mond's oratory was almost up to synthetic standards. I was wondering, said the savage, why you had them at all. Seeing that you can get whatever you want out of those bottles, why don't you make everybody an alpha double plus while you're about it? Mustafa Mond laughed. Because we have no wish to have our throats cut, he answered. We believe in happiness and stability. A society of alphas couldn't fail to be unstable and miserable. Imagine a factory staffed by alphas, that is to say, by separate and unrelated individuals of good heredity and conditioned so as to be capable, within limits, of making a free choice and assuming responsibilities. Imagine it, he repeated. The savage tried to imagine it, not very successfully. It's an absurdity. An decanted, alpha conditioned man would go mad if he had to do epsilon semi moron work. Go mad or start smashing things up. Alphas can't be completely socialized, but only on condition that you make them do alpha work. Only an epsilon can be expected to make epsilon sacrifices, for the good reason that for him, they aren't sacrifices. They're the line of least resistance. His conditioning has laid down rails along which he's got to run. He can't help himself. He's foredoomed. Even after decanting, he's still inside a bottle, an invisible bottle of infantile and embryonic fixations. Each one of us, of course, the controller meditatively continued, goes through life inside a bottle. But if we happen to be alphas, our bottles are, relatively speaking, enormous. We should suffer acutely if we were confined in a narrower space. You cannot pour uppercased champagne surrogate into lowercased bottles. It's obvious theoretically, but it has also been proved in actual practice. The result of the Cyprus experiment was convincing. What was that? Asked the savage. Mustafa Mond smiled. Well, you can call it an experiment in rebottling if you like. It began in AF 473. The controllers had the island of Cyprus cleared of all its existing inhabitants and recolonized with a specially prepared batch of 22,000 alphas. All agricultural and industrial equipment was handed over to them, and they were left to manage their own affairs. The result exactly fulfilled all the theoretical predictions. The land wasn't properly worked. There were strikes in all the factories. The laws were set at naught. Orders were orders disobeyed. All the people detailed for a spell of low-grade work were perpetually intriguing for high-grade jobs, and all the people with high-grade jobs were counter-intriguing at all costs to stay where they were. Within 6 years, they were having a first-class civil war. When 19 out of the 22,000 had been killed, the survivors unanimously petitioned the world controllers to resume the government of the island, which they did. And that was the end of the only society of alphas that the world has ever seen. The savage sighed profoundly. The optimum population, said Mustafa Mond, is modeled on the iceberg, 8/9 below the waterline, 1/9 above. And they're happier below the waterline? Happier than above it. Happier than your friend here, for example, he pointed. In spite of that awful work, awful, they don't find it so. On the contrary, they like it. It's light, it's childishly simple. No strain on the mind or the muscles. 7.5 hours of mild, unexhausting labor. And then the Soma ration and games and unrestricted copulation and the feelies. What more can they ask for? True, he added. They might ask for shorter hours, and of course, we could give them shorter hours. Technically, it would be perfectly simple to reduce all lowercase working hours to 3 or 4 a day. But would they be any the happier for that? No, they wouldn't. The experiment was tried more than a century and a half ago. The whole of Ireland was put on to the 4 hour day. What was the result? Unrest and a large increase in the consumption of soma. That was all. Those 3.5 hours of extra leisure were so far from being a source of happiness that people felt constrained to take a holiday from them. The Inventions Office is stuffed with plans for labor saving processes, thousands of them. Mustafa Mon made a lavish gesture. And why don't we put them into execution for the sake of the laborers? It would be sheer cruelty to afflict them with excessive leisure. It's the same with agriculture. We could synthesize every morsel of food if we wanted to, but we don't. We prefer to keep a third of the population on the land for their own sakes because it takes longer to get food out of the land than out of a factory. Besides, we have our stability to think of. We don't want to change. Every change is a menace to stability. That's another reason why we're so chary of applying new inventions. Every discovery is pure science and potentially subversive. Even science must sometimes be treated as a possible enemy. Yes, even science. Science. The savage frowned. He knew the word. But what it exactly signified he could not say. Shakespeare and the old men of the Pueblo had never mentioned science, and from Linda he had only gathered the vaguest hints. Science was something you made helicopters with, something that caused you to laugh at the corn dances, something that prevented you from being wrinkled and losing your teeth. He made a desperate effort to take the controller's meaning. Yes, Mustafa Mond was saying, that's another item in the cost of stability. It isn't only art that's incompatible with happiness, it's also science. Science is dangerous. We have to keep it most carefully chained and muzzled. What? Said Helmholtz in astonishment. But we're always saying that science is everything. It's a hypnopedic platitude. 3 times a week between 13 and 17, put in Bernard. And all the science propaganda we do at the college. Yes, but what sort of science? Asked Mustafa Mond sarcastically. You've had no scientific training, so you can't judge. I was a pretty good physicist in my time. Too good. Good enough to realize that all our science is just a cookery book with an orthodox theory of cooking that nobody's allowed to question, and a list of recipes that mustn't be added to except by special permission from the head cook. I'm the head cook now, but I was an inquisitive young scientist, oh, young scullion once. I started doing a bit of cooking on my own, unorthodox cooking, illicit cooking, a bit of real science. In fact, he was silent. What happened? Asked Helmholtz Watson. The controller sighed. Very nearly what's going to happen to you young men. I was on the point of being sent to an island.